7.5%. That is the percentage prices have gone up in 1 year according to official figures from the US government. But what if we're being lied to? Could it be possible that inflation numbers are all part of a gross and evil scheme meant to manipulate and keep us in the dark from knowing what is really occurring in this propped up economy? According to the Pew Research Center, our trust in the government has been falling off a cliff since the late 60s. Today, less than a quarter of the population answers yes to the following question, nearing an all-time low. And it's no surprise considering the events of the last 2 decades. Time and time again, it was proven that money, power, and special interests control many of our favorite politicians who would go as far as invading countries in order to fulfill these evil obligations. You see, back in the 1970s, America had a lot of problems. Recession, corruption, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and finally, severe inflation. The issues began in the early 70s when the CPI peaked at 12% before coming down a bit in the middle of the decade, then once again skyrocketing in 1980 up to 15%. This was a major shock for American consumers that rarely gets talked about. To help you understand just how bad this was, take for an example real estate costs. In 1970, the median house price in America was $23,000. By the end of the decade in 1980, it was $65,000. That's almost a 300% increase in 10 years. Eventually, to fix the disaster that was looming over the country, this guy came along and basically ruined the economy in order to save the currency. Paul Volcker jacked up the interest rate all the way to 19%, bringing America into a recession that stopped inflation in its tracks and gave way to an 80s boom in economic development. However, over time, America and its politicians forgot all about the suffering in the 70s, and eventually our policies went backwards. Today, low interest rates and more importantly money printing dominate Fed policy. And to make matters worse, it's very likely that those in power are well aware of this mistake. Inflation is officially measured by the United States Department of Labor, an organization that has changed the way they calculate CPI 9 times since 1968. In fact, if we estimate CPI with the same methodology used in 1980, inflation today would be just over 16%. That is the worst inflation reading in the history of America. Today we don't have Paul Volcker, we have Jerome Powell, and instead of jacking up the interest rate to 19%, Powell is thinking about, not even doing, but thinking about raising the rate to 0.5%. What do you think will happen next? Nobody can explain the situation better than Peter Schiff. Take a listen to a recent interview he did with Fox Business.
Yeah, well, I think he's wrong again. I think the Fed is going to be cutting rates again much sooner than Powell thinks. You know, Powell said a lot of foolish things today. And it was ironic that he began the press conference by praising Paul Volcker. And now he's going to resurrect the high inflation that Paul Volcker buried. But, you know, inflation was never created by economic growth or employment or wages. The Fed creates inflation. What's different now is there's been a lag between the inflation that the Fed creates and the impact that it has on consumer prices, which year over year is still up better than 2%. But a lot of that inflation is in the stock market, in the real estate market, in the bond market. The lag is what's longer. But that's what's going to change. We are going to be hit with a tsunami of inflation in this country. We're going to have an inflationary depression. You know what Powell just said is really rewriting the playbook for central bankers. He said, we're going to wait until inflation gets really bad before we do anything about it. In the past, you know, you wouldn't want to let the inflation genie get out of the bottle. Right. But that's what Powell is saying. We're going to let it out of the bottle. But you know what? Once it's out of the bottle, there is no way to put it back in. We have way too much debt in this country. Can you imagine a Fed, if they let the official inflation rate get to 3, 4, 5%, having to jack up interest rates to 7, 8, 9% to fight that inflation with all the government debt, with all the corporate debt, with all the consumer debt? This economy would implode like never before.
A fire. That's the word shift used to explain the current situation. For Americans around the country, they are slowly waking up to the fact that everything around them is getting significantly more expensive. Wages are supposedly going up, but how many of us actually received a 15% pay increase this year? Inflation is an invisible tax that wreaks havoc on the population. While you've been watching this video, your paycheck officially became worth almost 8% less. That's the real impact of inflation on your earnings. Obviously, I'm trying to be a bit dramatic here to make a point, but it's an important one. Instead of blaming Washington or the Fed, I'm a big believer in taking action when it comes to your financial future. That's why I did some research and came across a billion-dollar fintech startup called Masterworks. I think what they're doing is a great way to hedge against inflation. Masterworks lets you invest in blue chip art, an asset class that has appreciated 23% annually on average when inflation is above 3%. Their team of art experts analyzed over 60,000 data points to find trending artists with high potential for growth. They then purchased paintings by these artists. These are blue chip artists ranging from Picasso to Andy Warhol. After they go out and buy them, members can purchase shares representing an investment in those artworks on their platform. Since its inception in 2017, Masterworks has successfully offered and sold 2 paintings from its collection, each realizing a net annualized gain in excess of 30% per work. This is not an indication of Masterworks' overall performance, and past performance is not indicative of future results. So join over 300,000 other members on the platform by using my special link in the description to get priority access. Now back to the video. So Peter believes things are a lot worse than what the government admits, but let's focus back on the 1970s. At the end of the day, despite major setbacks, America recovered from this period of wild inflation, recession, and war. It was not until 2020 that we saw these problems reemerge. So what is stopping us from fixing it in the same way we fixed it in 1980? We can't always just focus on the negative. There has to be a way out. Take a listen to Peter destroy this argument.
So Peter, then what happens to the economy?
The economy is in a lot of trouble. It's massive stagflation. And the problem is people still don't recognize the box that the Fed put us in, because there is no interest rate that the Fed could put to fight inflation that the economy could withstand. If the Fed has to fight inflation, we not only have a massive recession and a crash in the stock market and the real estate market, but we have a much worse financial crisis than the one we had in 2008. See, the reason the Fed pretended that inflation was transitory when it obviously wasn't is because they have no ability to fight it. And now that they're no longer pretending that inflation is transitory, they're pretending that they're going to fight it when they can't.
And while it's easy to dismiss Peter as a glass half empty pessimist, we have to be realistic. Unfortunately, he has a great point. This is not 1980. First, we have to understand that today's market is much more sensitive to rate hikes than the one in 1980. Today, just talking about rates going up from 0 to 0.25% caused the market to dip. It's not an absurd opinion to say that today's economy simply cannot survive interest rates above 2%, let alone 19%. Even when Volcker raised the rate, it essentially brought America into a 2-year recession. On top of that, in today's political environment, you'll find exactly 0 officials who are willing to sacrifice short-term pain for long-term comfort. In 1979, Volcker was quoted saying Americans must trim their living standards in order to fix this inflation problem. Could you imagine multimillionaire Jerome Powell telling the American people they must suffer for a bit in order to save the currency? It would be political suicide. Everyone knows that if hypothetically Powell raised the rate to 10%, the stock market would be doomed, and so would your 401k and likely millions of other jobs around the country. It's simply not going to happen. Instead, the Fed will dance around the issue, pretending it's not there, downplaying it, or simply avoiding it, as they would rather inflate the currency than destroy the economy. How far this will go, nobody knows, but a soft landing, as they call it, a situation where the Fed is able to raise rates while keeping the economy afloat and at the same time reduce inflation, is nearly impossible at this point. If you disagree, I'd love to hear your take in the comments below. As always, thank you guys for watching. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed it. We are now less than 1,000 subscribers away from the coveted 100K mark, so any help would be greatly appreciated.